Hi everyone, my name is Corie, and today we are going to be recapping everything that the Bible says between 1 Samuel 17 and 2 Samuel chapter 12. This essentially is David's rise to power. We have David as a shepherd. We're actually introduced to him in 1 Samuel chapter 16, but he rises through the ranks of King Saul's army and becomes the king of Israel himself. And the story is essentially told in these chapters that we read today. So let's jump right in. 1 Samuel chapter 17. This is the famous chapter of the Bible. It's probably one of the most famous chapters of the Bible. It records the David and Goliath incident. So we have the Israelites and the Philistines, marching out to battle. They meet in the valley of Elah. They're camped on either side, and the Philistines have chosen their best warrior, the giant Goliath of Gath. Gath is the city of the Philistines that he was from. And so he goes down into the valley and he poses a challenge, a military challenge. We're going to see a few of these challenges, in this time period depicted from the Bible, where he essentially wants one-on-one, hand-to-hand combat with the best warrior of the Israelites. And the Israelites are afraid of him and they're not sure what to do. They're waiting for a man to volunteer for the position. So at this point in time, in 1 Samuel chapter 17, David is in part-time employment of Saul. He is an armor bearer, as we learned, on last week's video in 1 Samuel chapter 16. But we learn in this chapter that he comes and goes from his father's sheep, he's a shepherd for his father, to playing music for Saul. That kind of calms him down. So we also know at this point that David has also been secretly anointed as the next king of Israel, even though he is not related to Saul, the first king of Israel. So his family probably knows this because they were there. The brothers and his father Jesse were there when, Samuel was going through this process trying to figure out which one God had called to be the next king of Israel. And maybe this explains, if you've read this chapter, this explains why Eliab was a little bit salty towards David, assumed the worst of David, that he was conceited, and possibly he thought David was conceited because David had been anointed the next king. All right, so David's part-time employment with Saul probably explains why he was allowed to accept the challenge of Goliath, because he had already been established as a spiritual man. God would heal Saul through David's music. So David wants to fight Goliath. Saul decks him out in armor, but David's not used to wearing armor, so he rejects it. And David ends up defeating Goliath with a sling, which is a bit ironic because if you remember, King Saul is a Benjamite, and the Benjamites were famous for their training with the sling. So that had to have been a little bit of a hard pill to swallow for King Saul, that a young man without armor, without training, inexperienced in battle, defeated this enemy of Israel with a very weapon that Saul was trained in very well. Okay, David then brings Goliath's head to Jerusalem, which at this point is not an Israelite city, it's a Jebusite city. Perhaps this was a taunt to the Jebusites. Perhaps David, because he's from Bethlehem, is really familiar with this area and camps around Jerusalem. We're not sure, but it's interesting to think about. We're also told that David puts Goliath's weapons into his own tent. So this is his spoils of war. And at this point in this first chapter that we're recapping, Saul then starts to take more of an interest in David's family. He knows David, but now he's looking into David's family because of the marriage alliance that Saul has now promised to David as the warrior who defeated Goliath. Okay, that all happened in 1 Samuel chapter 17. Now here we go. 1 Samuel chapter 18. Saul keeps David on full time. At this point, he's become quite the Israelite celebrity. And Jonathan, Saul's son, who we later will find out is the crowned prince of Israel. He's in the army and he's expected to take over the throne from his father. He makes a covenant with David in which he gives him his clothes, literally the clothes off his body, and all of his weapons. Now, to us, this seems really weird. But in the ancient world, this was likely a transfer of authority. So Jonathan was essentially telling David that he backed David for the next king of Israel, that he was he was giving his right to the throne to David. So this was a really big deal. David, is a very successful warrior. The Bible tells us he raises up the ranks of the army very quickly, and this turns Saul against him. Saul gets jealous, Saul gets suspicious, and David ends up marrying Michal, Saul's younger daughter, and Saul is actually trying to use this as a way to get David killed because of the dowry. He says that David has to go, kill 100 Philistines and bring back their foreskins, and that will be the bride price for Michal, and David brings back 200 and does not die. So that plot does not work. Chapter 19, a lot happens in this chapter as well. Jonathan has to convince Saul not to kill David, and it works for a while, but as time passes, Saul tries to kill David again in an outburst of anger or rage. He tries to pin him to the wall with a spear, but David escapes, and then with the help of Michal, escapes the city as well. David runs, and he goes and stays with the prophet Samuel in Samuel's hometown of Ramah, and we get this really interesting moment that has to do with clothing as well, and that idea of clothing, specifically that of Jonathan and Saul as the king and the crown prince, that as representative of their authority. So Saul sends men to go get David from Samuel. And the first wave of men come, and as they approach Samuel and the prophets that are around Samuel, they begin to prophesy and join Samuel's group. So Saul sends a second wave of men, and the exact same thing happens. They join Samuel and begin to prophesy. So Saul himself comes, and this time on the way, Saul begins to prophesy. He's overcome by the Spirit of God. And when he gets into the presence of Samuel, he strips down naked. He takes off all of those symbols of royal authority and falls on his face before Samuel prophesying. So he's taking off that authority of kingship. He has been stripped of the authority that God gave him, which of course a few chapters earlier in Samuel, God has actually already said to Saul. Okay, 1 Samuel chapter 20. David and Jonathan then test Saul because after that, Saul wasn't, we kind of see this a few times. After this, Saul decides that he's not going to kill David anymore. So David and Jonathan test Saul to see if he's still planning on killing David. And of course he is. And this sparks a covenant because this is finally the last straw. David and Jonathan know that David can no longer come back to the house of Saul, to the army of Israel. He's on his own. So it's a very dramatic, emotional moment here in chapter 20. And it results in a covenant between David and Jonathan in regards to their families and the future of Israel. And I'll read you verses 13b. I'm going to start halfway through to 15. It says this. Jonathan says, "May the Lord be with you as he has been with my father. But show me unfailing kindness like the Lord's kindness as long as I live, so that I may not be killed. And do not ever cut off your kindness from my family, not even when the Lord has cut off every one of David's enemies from the face of the earth." So again, Jonathan is backing David as king and wants to secure friendship and peace between the children of Jonathan and the children of David. In verse 31, Saul curses Jonathan for helping David, and this is when we find out he's the crown prince, and the quote is this from verse 31, "As long as the son of Jesse lives on this earth, neither you nor your kingdom will be established." And then he says a little bit more, and he goes, "He must die." So there we go. 1 Samuel chapter 21. So David is traveling with men who are loyal to him. So apparently some deflected from the military. Not entirely surprising as he rose through the ranks and was quite popular. So David stops at the city of Nob, and this priest, where the tent tabernacle is believed to have been pitched here at Nob, and David asks the priest for supplies to feed his men, and there's no food except for the bread of the presence, that bread that sits in the tabernacle before God, and then once a week they take it out and replace it with fresh stuff. Well, that week old stuff was the only bread and provisions that they had there. So they gave it to David and his men, and they also gave David Goliath's sword, which means that David must have donated this sword to the tabernacle at an earlier time period. Okay, David then does an interesting choice. He takes Goliath's sword and he goes to Goliath's hometown of Philistine Gath. But David instantly regrets his decision because at the city gate he is recognized by the officials of the king and he's scared. So he pretends to be insane. He pretends to have, lost it a bit so that he's not seen as a threat. That brings us to chapter 22. David's brothers and all of his father's household travel to him. He is traveled onto the cave of Adullam, and all of his family travels there because apparently not even they were safe from Saul. They had to leave Bethlehem. We're also told that other men who were in trouble or unhappy with Saul also flocked to David. So at that time, it was about 400 men. David ends up traveling to the nation of Moab and making an agreement, a deal with the king of Moab so that his father's household can live there in safety from King Saul. We learn that Saul was quite unhinged because he massacres not only the priests of Nob for helping David, but also the town of Nob and its civilian population as well. And it should be noted that the officials of King Saul, the Israelite officials, absolutely refused to do this. They would not do this. But Saul also had someone named Doeg the Edomite, so a non-Israelite in his staff, and this man had no problem massacring the people. So foreigners in Saul's service. One priest from Nob, Abiathar, escapes and he goes and he lives with David and he becomes a key figure in David's camp. So remember that name, Priest Abiathar, the sole survivor from the Nob massacre. Chapter 23, David saves a Judahite from the tribe of Judah. A Judahite city named Keilah. Your guess is as good as mine with these English transliterations, but saves them from the Philistine raiding parties, and Saul hears about it, so he tries to trap him in that city, but David escapes, and he, at this point, is going from place to place to place to avoid detection. We learn also in this chapter that the plan was for Jonathan to eventually be second to David when David became king, so perhaps that meant commander over the military or something of that nature. The Ziphites, who were from a city in Judah, betray David. Remember, David is of the tribe of Judah. So his own tribe here is not with him. They are pro-Saul. They're backing Saul the king, and they betray David to Saul, give up his location. And an interesting note here is Psalm 54 was written in response to this action. So David wrote Psalm 54 in response to this action. So that's just fun if you want to go to Psalm 54 and read that. Okay, chapter 24. After a battle with the Philistines, Saul is told that David is living in En-Gedi, this oasis in Israel near the Dead Sea. And Saul goes into a cave. He's going to En-Gedi and he goes into a cave to relieve himself, to go to the washroom. But David and his men are in the cave. And David won't let anyone hurt him, but he decides to sneak up and cut off a piece of his robe, to prove that he bears him no ill will. But he regrets this action as well, because remember, clothing, especially of a king or of a noble or a dignitary, represented their authority. So, David ends up confronting Saul, and he says in verse 12 to 13, "May the Lord judge between me and you. And may the Lord avenge the wrongs you have done to me, but my hand will not touch you. As the old saying goes, from evildoers come evil deeds. So my hand will not touch you." And David swears that he will not kill Saul or Saul's family. In chapter 25, we have a record of Samuel the prophet dying in Ramah, his hometown, and being buried there. And enter the scene this brutal man Nadab and his wife Abigail. They are wealthy and very powerful Calebites from living in the tribe of Judah, who own the territory around the city of Hebron, which will become David's capital city later on. Now, Nabal clearly supports Saul. He even says to David asks him for provisions because he's been protecting Nabal's shepherds and their flocks. And Nabal says this: many servants are breaking away from their masters these days. And he refuses to help David. So in essence, David has rebelled against Saul. He's just a slave and he's rebelled against his master Saul, and basically calling all of his men ragtags and awful rebellers. And this was of a huge offense to David, and he made it up in his mind that he was going to destroy Nabal and his whole household. But Nabal's wife Abigail intercedes, and she talks reason into David, really changes his mind. And 10 days later, Nabal dies. So this is trying to show, it's giving an example of how God was establishing David. He didn't have to fight those kinds of battles. God was going to establish his kingship for him. We also learn that David has 2 wives besides Michal that he just left with Saul. And both of these wives are from Judah, probably very prominent families. So it seems like David is trying to secure a base of allegiance in Judah, his tribe, through marriage. Because as we've seen, his influence in his own tribe is a bit tenuous because we have those Ziphites betraying him, and Nabal, the Calebite, hated him. So it's not going well. And we also get a record that Saul officially, he tried to divorce Michal from David, and he remarried her to another man from a different tribe. So he's essentially trying to take David away from any claim to the throne of Saul. Okay, chapter 26. Those Ziphites of Judah, they rat on David again to Saul. And David and Abishai, who's a character who will again come up, David's nephew, they sneak into Saul's camp, steal his spear and his water jug again, just to prove that they don't want to kill him. In chapter 27, David and his men get their families and they go back to Gath. And the king of Gath gives them the city of Ziklag. And even though it's in Philistine territory, that becomes an Israelite city. And they live there for just over a year. They go out raiding enemy territory, enemies of Israel, I should say. And they kill everyone. It's very brutal. They kill everyone so that no one can bring a report back to the Philistines. And David lies and tells the king of Gath that they're actually raiding Israel and bringing back wealth to the Philistines. Chapter 28, the Philistines go to war against Israel again, and Saul, who is very afraid because he's inquired of the Lord, and the Lord has not answered him. So he's done sacrifices, he's consulted the prophets of God, he's consulted the priests of God using the Urim and Thummim, and God is not answering. So he uses a medium from Endor to summon Saul's spirit, Samuel's spirit. Saul summons Samuel's spirit through a medium, and it doesn't go well. It's very interesting, though, in chapter 28. The message ends up being, you're going to die tomorrow in battle, and David is going to be king. Chapter 29, the Philistine commanders send David home because they don't trust him. David was going to fight in the war with them. He was going to turn on them for sure. And the Philistine commanders very wisely don't trust a Hebrew to fight Hebrews. Chapter 30, David returns to Ziklag, and while he was away following the Philistines into battle, the Amalekites had raided and stolen all of their families and goods. So David and the men inquire of God and go chase the Amalekites down, and they get their families back. The Bible also tells us, this is another hint that not all is well in the tribe of Judah when it comes to allegiance to David. David takes all of the plunder that he got from killing the Amalekites, and he divides it up and sends tribute to all the family heads in the tribe of Judah. So you see what he's doing. He's made the marriage alliances with some powerful families in Judah, so it's essentially a peace treaty. And now he's sending tribute to the family heads. See, it's going to be good for me if I'm your king. I can take care of you. Look at all the spoils of my war. I can lead you. So it's an interesting thing. It's if you track it through David's track record, how he tried to butter up the tribe of Judah. And it ends up working. Okay, chapter 31, the last chapter in 1 Samuel. Saul, Jonathan, and Saul's other sons die in battle with the Philistines. There's a note that says that when the Israelites of the area realized what had happened to Saul and his sons, they actually abandoned the cities of the surrounding area, and the Philistines occupy them. So the bodies of Saul and his sons are hung up on the wall of the city of Bethshan, and Saul's armor goes to some Philistine temples. So it's a pretty brutal scene. The men of Jabesh Gilead in Israel, the city who had been saved by Saul at the beginning of his reign, they go and they retrieve the bodies of Saul and his sons. They're returning that favor. So they retrieve the bodies, they burn them. They were probably pretty far decomposed at that point, being hung out in the hot wilderness and exposed to the elements and the animals. And then they bury the remains. And that is the end of 1 Samuel. So 2 Samuel chapter 1, David hears of Saul and Jonathan's death from an Amalekite, a member of Saul's army, who claims to have finished Saul off because Saul was dying, but he was suffering and he wanted to die faster. So he asked the Amalekite to kill him. So the story goes. And the Amalekite brings Saul's crown and armband to David as a show of loyalty, but David ends up executing the man for killing the king of Israel. Then he mourns officially for Saul and Jonathan. Chapter 2, David moves back into the tribe of Judah to that city of Hebron, and the tribal leaders of Judah come to him and they crown him their king. So he is king of Judah, just that one tribe of Israel. Abner, who was the army commander of Saul, installs Saul's younger son Ishbosheth as king over the rest of Israel. And there's war between the house of Saul and the house of David. Joab, who is David's nephew, one of David's nephews, commander of David's army, he meets Abner and Ishbosheth's army, that's hard to say, at this place called the Pool of Gibeon, which is known archaeologically now. It's a place that we know where it is, for a contest of arms, another military contest. This contest ties and a battle breaks out. Abner's side loses and Abner's on the run. And we get this really brutal story of Joab's brother, Azael, running. He was famous for being a fast runner. And apparently he was unarmed. Maybe he dropped his weapons so that he could go faster. That part's unknown, but he is unarmed and he's chasing Abner and he's going to catch Abner. And Abner tells him, go off to the side and fight one of my young men and steal their weapons and then we'll fight. And Azael won't do it. And so Abner ends up at one point stopping really abruptly with his spear butt behind him and kills Azael with the butt of his spear. So very brutal. The battle is ended this way, essentially. Chapter 3, we learn of 4 more wives of David. He's making more marriage alliances, it appears. One of these wives is a princess of Geshur, which is an important territory with a strong military, so an important treaty to have. But later this will cause many familial problems for David. Abner, meanwhile, has kind of secretly tried to take over the kingdom from Saul's son Ishbosheth, but when he's accused of it, he leaves and he decides that he's going to back David. As part of this defecting to David, he ends up bringing Michal, David's first wife, back to David. It's very brutal. And Abner begins brokering this takeover of David. He has ties with all the tribes of Israel and he's brokering, okay, David's going to become your king. I'm going to make it work out for you. But here's the problem. Joab wants justice or revenge for his brother's death. And he does not trust Abner's motives, so he ends up killing Abner. Now, David is in a pickle here. This is a very bad situation. So, because he's in these tenuous peace talks with all the tribes of Israel. And the man who's brokering peace was just murdered by his own commander of the army, by David's commander. So David publicly curses Joab. Now, this might have been more political expediency than, personal reality for David, because he keeps Joab as the commander of his army. But it would look really bad. It would look horrible if David was seen to have been involved in any way in Abner's death. This man who was effectively leading the rest of the tribes to come into David's kingship. Joab didn't care about any of this. So after David, publicly shames Joab and Abishai and Azael even, the people of Israel were really pleased by this. They were satisfied that David didn't have anything to do with Abner's death. Chapter 4, 2 men assassinate poor Ishbosheth, Saul's son, and they take his head to David as proof, and David has them executed. David does not like this game of killing kings, maybe because he was one, maybe because he knew it wasn't the right thing to do, and he took God's anointing seriously. We can never be quite sure, but we know that he's serious about it. We learn also that Jonathan has a surviving son named Mephibosheth. In chapter 5, David finally becomes king of all Israel, and we get this note that David conquers Jerusalem, his capital city, and that David effectively subdues the Philistines. In chapter 6, David tries to bring the Ark of the Covenant from Kiriath Jearim to Jerusalem. But they don't read the law of Moses. They don't take into account how the ark is supposed to be moved. And so a man ends up dying. And they try much later, months later, successfully to bring the Ark of the Covenant to Jerusalem. This celebration with David dancing ends up in a very salty interaction between a bitter Michal. It's hard to blame her here, but it wasn't the right move. She was very bitter and, mocked David for being undignified before his subjects. And eventually this altercation ends, and the Bible says that Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no children to the day of her death. Some take this as a punishment of God, but it's just as likely that David and Michal just were never intimate after this moment. That was it. Their marriage was essentially over. Okay, chapter 7, David wants to build a temple for God because now he's sitting in a cushy palace. And God says, no, not you. You're a man of war. Instead, we get the Davidic covenant. This is when God makes a covenant with David that he's going to build him a house. God's going to build David a house, an everlasting dynasty. Chapter 8, we get a record of David's military accomplishments and a record of David's highest officials, so who was running the show. Chapter 9, David finally honors Jonathan's son Mephibosheth. He gives him all of Saul's land, and he has Mephibosheth live in Jerusalem and eat at the king's table like one of the princes of Israel, one of David's sons. Chapter 10, we're told that the king of Ammon died, whom David had a peace treaty with. He's got a working relationship with him, so he sends envoys to extend peace to the next king of Ammon, and that king misinterprets it as a ploy, and so he humiliates David's men, and David sends Joab and his army to fight them. And we get to see Joab's military prowess as he has to fight on two different battlefronts, but he ends up winning. In chapter 11, we learn what was unfortunately happening with David while Joab was out defeating the Ammonites, and that is Bathsheba. David knew he has an affair with Bathsheba, but he knew she was the wife of one of his mighty men who was out fighting his battle for him. And he chooses to sleep with her anyway. Then when he finds out that she's pregnant, he has Uriah come back from the battle, and he tries to get Uriah to sleep with Bathsheba so he would think it was his kid. When that doesn't work, he tells Joab to without an explanation, to get Uriah killed in battle, which Joab does. And then after Bathsheba's finished mourning for her dead husband, David marries her. And in verse 27, lest we think that any of this behavior was because it's recorded in the Bible, it's good to go. No way. Chapter 27 says, but the thing David did displeased the Lord. Yes, obviously. Okay, chapter 12, Nathan the prophet rebukes David, and David, to his credit, accepts the rebuke. He admits that he's wrong. As a result, Nathan the prophet predicts that David's son Absalom, he predicts Absalom's rebellion. He predicts that the sword is never going to leave David's house. There's always going to be trouble. And that the son that was just born to Bathsheba was going to die. And all of these things happen. Bathsheba has another son that they name Solomon, but God names him Jedediah. Solomon is the name that most of us know him by. And yeah, we also learn of the capture of the city of Rabbah from the Ammonites. All right, we're done. I told you there is a lot of history, a lot of details, intimate details that are recorded in these chapters. They are definitely worth a read. I probably was not able to do justice to the interest of them because there's just a lot of information to cover. But I hope that you, for the sake of all of those reasons, we're able to read some of these chapters this week. And if not, some of them are definitely worth going back and reading. So if any of these piqued your interest, do it. Go read it. As we move into the time period of the Kings, we're getting into some really interesting history that has a lot, not only to tell us about how God interacts with human nature, but also, what he was doing with Israel as a nation for our benefit. So I hope you have a really good week. Leave your comments and your questions down in the comments below. I'll be interacting there with you, answering as many questions as I can. I hope you guys have a really great week. See you later.